Well, welcome to the final session of the day, what I think has been a really fascinating day of discussion, and what better way to bring it to a close than with one of the architects of New Labour and of the victory in 1997, Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson of Foy. As Business Secretary, Northern Ireland Secretary, First Secretary of State, and EU Commissioner, the Sultan of Spin, Peter Mandelson was a participant in...
Now the Dark Lord.
The Dark Lord, yes. A participant in almost every stage of the New Labour story. And we're delighted that he's joined us to reflect on the history of New Labour, one might say from cradle to grave.
I must say, everyone is looking incredibly alive. I thought that I would come into this room after you'd been here for 5 or 6 hours, and this route march that you've been on.
It's been strangely energizing.
And you'd be a bit like that Steve Bell cartoon that I remember from the first Labour Listens event in 1987-88, which took place in Brighton. And this is a wonderful programme called Labour Listens, in which Labour went around the country listening to the public. And I took Roy Hattersley, Frank Dobson, and Anne Taylor to Brighton for about a 2-hour session during which the three of them basically talked to the audience. and Steve Bell did this wonderful cartoon of the entire room consisting of people who were completely asleep, snoring, comatose, had turned into skeletons or were being taken out on stretchers. Labour Listens never fully recovered from Steve Bell's cartoon.
Well, I think that's something for us to aim for today. So we are going to begin by talking to you. We're going to be in conversation for about 20 minutes or so, and then we're going to throw it open to questions from the floor. So we're very keen to have your comments and ideas and reminiscences and questions. But I'd like to start by taking you back to 1997 and to Election Day. And of course, this was only 5 years after the crushing defeat, the really devastating defeat of 1992. And I wondered whether there was ever a moment in 97 when you thought that history might repeat itself, when you thought that Labour might lose.
You thought that every day. I mean, every day it would enter your head that we were going to lose and that history was going to repeat itself. I mean, bear in mind that Labour has quite a losing streak, going back over the last century. So it wouldn't have been entirely surprising if we'd lost again. But all that did really was to increase the sort of intensity of the whole thing. And when I think of 1997 and think of Millbank, I think of, what do I think of? I think of huge idealism. I mean, we were incredibly excited and fired up by what we were going to do for the country. We were literally going to transform it, modernize it, I mean, politically, economically, and socially. The intensity, which matched the idealism. I mean, when I say intensity, I mean literally nothing was ignored or overlooked. I mean, we applied our intensive skills to everything that moved. We were very ambitious in what we were seeking to pull off. And there was huge camaraderie. I mean, people were so loyal to each other. I mean, everyone was there to support everyone else's effort, whatever they were doing, whether they were, tied to a media monitoring screen or a laptop, tapping out a press release or a policy, or in the dispatch, putting out leaflets around the country. I mean, whatever anyone did, I mean, everyone was of equal importance, and everyone was equally loyal to everyone else. It was just a wonderful, wonderful sense of being alive.
And you took the decision...
And then the New Dawn came.
The New Dawn, yes. Well, thinking about how we got to that New Dawn, you took the decision in that campaign to fight not simply as a changed Labour Party, but as New Labour, as something novel. And I wonder why you thought it was so important to rebrand the entire party in that way.
Well, because of our history, because voters have memories, and we had, frankly, a lot to live down. I mean, in 1997, I mean, let's be honest, we were not only moving the country forward from Thatcher and John Major with a very ambitious programme with which to do so, but frankly, we were also moving forward from the post-war Labour Party of Wilson and Callaghan. Look, those governments achieved an enormous amount, but Harold's government in the 1960s ended with a massive public spending crisis, a forced devaluation, and the government being humiliated at the hands of the trade unions over the retreat from in place of strife. Harold and Jim Callaghan's government in the 1970s ended, I'm afraid, pretty similarly. I mean, it ended with a massive public spending crisis, a bailout by the IMF, and the trade unions' winter of discontent. Now, the Labour Party's answer to that, if you remember, at the beginning of the 1980s, was Tony Benn's takeover of the whole policy-making function of the Labour Party as chairman of the Home Policy Committee, and then running Dennis Healey to within an inch, a whisker of his political life in challenging him for the deputy leadership, plus Michael Foot and the 1983 manifesto that had us coming out of Europe, sort of blockading the country so that we could implement some sort of siege economy, just before we threw all our nuclear weapons unilaterally into the North Sea. I mean, voters have memories, and we did have a lot to move on from. And then, thank God, Neil Kinnock came along and started literally changing the course of Labour. But even then, his first year was spent with Arthur Scargill leading a year-long miners' strike. Is a remarkable achievement by Arthur Scargill. He started by leading a huge union, living in quite a modest house, and he ended up with a decimated union in a much larger house. I don't quite know how he managed to do that, but in the course of that, he inflicted huge public damage on the reputation of the Labour Party and nearly derailed Neil's leadership in the first year. And the 1987 general election, which was the first one that I had managed as the Labour Party's campaign director, having been appointed in 1985, was literally a battle for survival. We went to the 87 general election in third place in 2 opinion polls when the firing pistol, began, and we survived. But it was only a survival, and then we went on to, with no real overhaul of the party or our policies. We then went on to 1992 with a modest revision of policies and party, and we were successful in 1992 in reinstating ourselves as the challenger to the Tories, as the alternative party of government. But you can understand, therefore, by the time we got to the 1990s, why we had a lot to live down, why we had a lot to recover from, why we had a lot of sort of memories and folklore associated with Labour and Labour governments to put behind us. And therefore, it really was a massive political project, a sort of huge revisionist project that we had to mount, both in transforming the party and then putting forward a programme that would succeed in transforming the country. And that's what 1990s was all about.
But were there any costs to that project? And I ask partly because I was very struck rereading your memoir that you, on the one hand,
still available, by the way,
in all good bookshops, yes. But you were an architect of New Labour, but you're also actually somebody whose family is very deeply rooted in the Labour Party. Your grandfather was a minister in the Attlee government. You grew up knowing the Wilson family. You were involved in the Young Socialists. And I wonder, were you so keen to emphasise the novelty that you underplayed the extent to which New Labour actually was in a continuous Labour tradition, which then made it possible to cast New Labour as cuckoos in the nest, as having somehow taken over a party that didn't belong to you.
Well, I did feel it was important not to sort of disown or literally uproot the Labour Party from its history. I mean, I couldn't do that even if I tried, given my family and where I'd come from. And by the way, in describing what we were doing, our project in the 1990s as a sort of a reinvention project of both party and programme, frankly, the only comparable project that had been mounted in the Labour Party was actually in the mid-late 1930s, as we recovered from the meltdown of 1931 and the loss of all our seats. I mean, that was a huge revisionist project, which then paved the way for our victory in 1945. And that reinvention project had been undertaken, I mean, in a sense, intellectually by Hugh Dalton and organisationally by my grandfather, with a little bit of help from Michael Young. Where's Lisa? If you remember. And Michael Young held the pen and wrote the manifesto in 1945 under my grandfather's supervision. And that was revisionist. I mean, and when I mean by what I mean by revisionist is literally, I mean, a complete respect for the timeless values and objectives and goals of the Labour Party, but an absolute ruthless questioning of the means by which we achieve those goals, so that with every generation and every government, we look again at how we want best to deliver those goals and deliver those objectives that the Labour Party has, which, as I say, are timeless, but the means need to be very, very rigorously questioned. And once they're rigorously questioned and policies are put together, they've then got to be very, very vigorously projected and communicated, which is basically what the Labour Party's got to do now. It's got to mix rigour and vigour.
So can I ask what you see those timeless values as being? So, for example, would you describe yourself as a socialist?
I would describe myself as a social democrat, yes.
But not as a socialist?
Well, no, I wouldn't actually. I've always described myself as a social democrat. I believe in a mixed economy. I believe in a partnership between government and private sector. I believe people have to be incentivized and rewarded if they're going to invest and take risks. And socialism, certainly as it's been understood during the last century, basically has a connotation of centralized control, state planning, and domination of the economy. And no, I don't believe that. I'm a market-based economy man, a dynamic market-based economy man who believes in a very active industrial strategy, as people discovered when I came back to the government in 2008. Not everyone welcomed it, by the way.
Well, I wonder if one of the unintended consequences here.
Ed Balls was the man principally who opposed it. I remember in the National Economic Council, he said, this isn't not very New Labour, Peter. He said, I thought we believed in, letting markets operate and of their own free will. What are you trying to do to sort of interfere and tell people where to invest? And it was an interesting discussion.
Well, talking of people who opposed aspects of what you were doing, I wonder if one of the paradoxes here is that Jeremy Corbyn, who was somebody who had been at odds with every Labour government of his lifetime, was able to present himself as the authentic face of Labour's tradition in 2015 because he wasn't New Labour. Because in a sense you had surrendered Labour's past.
That's because Jeremy was able to do that in 1915 because in the 5 years prior to that, a sort of intellectual and political void had been created in the Labour Party.
I think you mean 2015. It may have felt like
1915. No, 2015. Yes. I mean, there was just a sort of, I think people in the party just felt they were just sort of drifting in no particular direction at all in 2015. I mean, they knew that, New Labour was being repudiated. We knew that that had to be sort of put behind us and buried, but replaced with what? Nobody was at all clear. And the people who stood in the leadership election in 2015 basically seemed to be, I mean, it was sort of basically they were a continuation of what had gone on during the previous 5 years since we left government in 2010. The only person who was presenting anything sort of bold and different was Jeremy. I mean, the fact that it was bold, different, and barking and election losing didn't really occur to people at the time as much as I would have wished they'd had.
You talked about your own ambition in the 90s, as in the ambition of the party. I wonder, coming from 4 election defeats, and as you say, that sense throughout 97 that you might lose, is it possible that because of that, New Labour underestimated the appetite for change and therefore underestimated the potential for a radical moment? No?
Quite the contrary. The country was literally crying out for change. I mean, they were desperate to move on from the Tories, rather as people are now. And
but did Labour's offer in 97 match that?
We didn't have a government in the 1990s that seemed to have any sort of central or core purpose to it at all. I mean, heaven knows what the John Major government thought they were going to do to sort of, you know, modernise the country and take it into the next century. I mean, there was apart from the traffic cones and the motorways, I mean, what else was there? I mean, there was not a great deal more, and I think that's what people feel now, that that this government has no sort of sense of purpose or plan. I mean, what is the plan?
Well, when you swept aside the traffic cones and came into government in 1997, how difficult was it to make the shift from campaigning to governing? Because that's something that came up earlier in the day.
I don't think we made the shift adequately. I remember writing in 2001 a new introduction, preface to the book that Roger Liddell and I had previously written and published in 1996. And I did very, very tentatively make this sort of observation or criticism that the government had sort of almost unwittingly, but perhaps it should have realised, had sort of continued governing as it had been campaigning, with far too much emphasis on media management. And I think one of the problems in Number 10, when we came into government in 1997, was that the dominant personality was on the media side and insufficiently on the policy side. I wouldn't expect David Miliband to agree with that. But I think that too much energy, attention, the Prime Minister's time and activity was taken up with media matters at the expense of policy matters.
So what would have been a healthier way to have managed the relationship with the media?
Well, we had to professionalise, obviously, the way in which the government presented its policies and what it was doing. I mean, not suggesting for one moment that we sort of carry on in that sort of ramshackle, hapless way that, you know, poor John Major had sort of suffered at the hands of the media. Of course, it needed to be professionalised. But as well as professionalising it, it was overly prioritised, in my view.
I was struck in your memoirs that you say early on that you reflect on all that we achieved and all that we failed to achieve. And we've talked quite a lot, I think, today about the achievements of the New Labour period. I wonder what you think it failed to achieve.
Oh gosh. I think that, I mean, I suppose I would say this, wouldn't I? But I wish that we had arrived at a more coherent, thoughtful approach to industrial policy and strategy, rather than sort of discovering it a bit late in the government's life. When I came back in 2008, I think there is more that we could and should have done structurally to change the UK economy. I think that notwithstanding devolution to Scotland and Wales, I think we left sort of English government and actually UK government too centralised. I think if we should have had a much more active programme of sort of political decentralisation across government in England, but then there was a sort of, I don't know, there was a sort of tension really inside the government between those who just wanted to sort of reinvent sort of local government and municipalism, those in the government who thought that should be the last thing we did because they would just be bound to be taken over by loony lefties all over again, and those who were much more revisionist in their thinking and felt that we should develop a more sort of regional style of government in which directly elected and executive mayors should play a much bigger part. And I don't think that we ever reached a settled view in the government as to how we should revitalise local and regional government. We created regional development agencies, which were very, very effective instruments of policy, which ultimately rested in the hands of central government rather than local or regionally elected representatives. They were very effective, and they certainly shouldn't have been abolished by the incoming coalition government. They should have been reformed. They should have been further adapted from our experience of them. Were there other policy deficits? Housing, I feel we could and should have done more in relation to housing. Transport, possibly.
I'll ask about Europe, since of course you were an EU commissioner.
Yeah.
And I wonder how, in the wake of Brexit, how you reflect on New Labour's attitude towards the EU and the aspiration of putting Britain at the heart of Europe.
Well, we did. I mean, we did. I mean, I will always remember, I was a commissioner by this time, but I remember during the UK presidency in, I think it was the second half of 2005, when Tony called an informal summit of member state heads of government, and it took place in Hampton Court. And literally the entire strategic direction and agenda of the European Union was reassessed and reformulated. I know this because, having been a member of the Commission for the previous year, I went to Brussels in 2004, climate change was barely mentioned. Suddenly it went whizzing up right to the top of the European agenda. That was the result of Tony's informal summit in Hampton Court, and there were other key areas of policy making and activity that fell into place as a result of that summit, and that was Britain absolutely being at the heart of Europe.
But does that speak to a wider disconnect between the role that Britain plays in European institutions and the place of Europe in Britain's domestic political discourse? Did New Labour fail to move the dial in public opinion, or to communicate more effectively to the public the role that Britain could play as a leading country in the European Union?
Well, possibly, but in my memory, it wasn't actually contested. Europe was not an issue. Europe had been an issue in the 1990s under the Conservative government. But broadly speaking, I mean, Europe as an issue, it was just accepted that our membership of the European Union was basically, a good thing, that we were at the heart of its decision making. We were incredibly influential, and it helped drive both our prosperity, our economic growth, and our security as a continent. I don't remember Tony shying away from ever making a very positive, very clearly articulated statements about Europe. Gordon was a bit more sort of comme ci, comme ça later on. But it really wasn't. It wasn't a live issue. It then, of course, became completely reignited after the Conservative-led government took over, and David Cameron found himself sort of chased all over the place by Farage and UKIP, and the sort of civil war, as it were, in the Conservative Party was re-triggered, and then it started going up the media agenda, and therefore the public's, and the rest is history.
But that makes me think of a point that was made earlier on, I think, by a member of the audience.
I mean, is that sounding too complacent? I don't know. I just don't.
Well, actually, I wonder, one of the arguments that might come back against that would be the idea that actually New Labour was an architect of Brexit because of its
everything is laid at our door. We're blamed for absolutely everything.
Okay, but
so why should that be an exception?
Well,
I mean, I suppose
some of the allegations might be true, and one would relate to the accessor states and whether New Labour made a terrible mistake by not implementing transitional controls, or indeed making the case for not implementing.
Hindsight's a very useful thing, but all I can say to you is that in 2004, we did not see any reason, in principle or practice, not to make that transition immediately. You have to understand that we were running what, for all intents and purposes, was a full employment economy in 2004. And there were sectors of the economy, service sectors of the economy, caring, hospitality, and other parts of the services base, and laundry and whatever, who were employing a lot of people, particularly, or including on a seasonal basis in agriculture, were crying out for people to come and take up work in Britain. I mean, those were businesses that needed more people to work in their sectors and in their businesses. It didn't at the time seem, therefore, such a bad idea that those who needed to recruit additional labour and employees should look to the accession states to recruit them. And it didn't seem such a bad idea for people in those accession states who wanted to come and work in Britain to do so. But of course, the advice that we had at the time, or they had, I wasn't in the government at the time, was that probably, a couple of 100,000 would take up the opportunities of employment in Britain as a result. Now, of course, it was far more than that. I think what was underestimated was the pulling power, the allure of coming to work in Britain. Britain had an incredibly strong, vibrant, attractive reputation and standing in Europe at the time. And of course, people, if they did speak a second language, that tended to be English. And therefore, to use that in gaining employment in Britain seemed an obvious thing to do, rather more than, say, for many, Germany or France. So the number of people coming here was hugely underestimated.
It speaks perhaps to a question that somebody raised earlier, which is whether New Labour was unsuccessful at entrenching the things that it did in governments, that many of the things that it did were easily reversible, and that might apply to things like tax credits, or it might apply to things like welfare spending, or indeed it might apply to things like putting Britain at the heart of Europe.
You don't think that David Cameron's government and the coalition, broadly speaking, adopted the New Labour agenda? They certainly adopted the New Labour campaign manual, but there's I think that the way in which our framing of policy was very much adopted.
So you would regard the Cameron government as a New Labour continuation?
After a fashion, on a good day.
Even with austerity?
Well, austerity, followed the global financial crisis, for which I think we do carry some responsibility, actually. I know that it didn't start in Britain. It started in the mortgage business somewhere in California or whatever, and was transmitted to Britain. But actually, financial markets in Britain were underregulated. And with hindsight, I think I would acknowledge that we should have known more about what was happening in financial markets, or at least sort of monitored and analysed a little better than we did the extraordinary acceleration of change, of behaviour and new products that were going insufficiently monitored and regulated in financial markets. I mean, to say that we created the global financial crisis is obviously ridiculous. But I do think that the Labour government early on had a rather sort of Alan Greenspanian sort of love affair with free markets in the financial sector, which, with the benefit of hindsight, could have done with a little bit more analysis and regulation.
Well, perhaps one more.
And austerity, which we're now told by Boris Johnson was excessive and unjustified, inflicted massive damage on people and communities across the country. And no sooner had we dealt with the scene of austerity, we then had the pandemic. It's not surprising that people in this country, feel that for a decade at least, we've just it's been a roller coaster of one crisis after another, which has attacked their living standards, made them poorer, less confident, with fewer opportunities in their lives. And that's how people feel now, and why they want a proper diagnosis of Britain's problems and what's happened, and a proper understanding of the challenges that we face in this country coming from the Labour Party. That's what they want now.
Well, that raises the question then of why Labour has struggled to establish a durable polling lead of the kind that you did in the 90s under the current economic situation. I wonder what your diagnosis of that would be.
Summed up in 2 words: Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, he dug an enormous great hole and threw the Labour Party into it. And we've just done, as a result of all that Keir and his team have achieved over the last 2 years, climbed out of that hole, and we're now back at ground level. Back at ground level after what we have been through as a party. But a ground level which is not sort of consisting of a sort of swamp, which is essentially what has been created, but now on much firmer foundations on which we've got to build, a shiny city, a shiny citadel to present to people at the next election. They have to know what they're going to vote for. They need a programme of government, what a new Britain is going to consist of, and what a Labour government will have achieved after 1 or 2 terms of premiership of Keir Starmer. They're unclear about that at the moment, because the last 2 years have been spent fighting a pandemic and clearing up after Jeremy Corbyn. We've now got a different project to embark on. I mean, the party project, if you like, the party renewal project has taken us the last 2 years. We now have a sort of a governing project to take on. And my God, do we have precious little time in order to do it, but it can be done. And that's what Keir and his team have got to turn to next.
Well, that seems like a good moment to turn to the audience. So I think we've got just under 10 minutes for questions. So I'd like to see if there are any questions from students, or are you a student or no? Excellent. Well, would you like to take the microphone and kick us off?
Hi, I'm a student at the London Academy of Excellence.
In Stratford.
He's done his homework.
It's how New Labour was built, on detail.
Brilliant, amazing. So you mentioned Corbyn, and I was going to ask, do you think his criticism of Blair's government, particularly the accusation of him kind of ruining the economy, do you think that has some truth to it?
That Blair ruined the economy?
Yeah, that's what he said in 2015. And how do you think this damaged his reputation and his legacy that he kind of created in 1997? Thank you.
I think Jeremy Corbyn's done more damage to his own reputation and legacy than any harm that he's inflicted on Tony Blair. Okay. I mean, let's be honest. If anyone was going to criticise you, I mean, you wouldn't be worse off than having Jeremy Corbyn doing so.
Okay, well, I'm going to suggest that we take a cluster of questions so that we can fit as many people in as possible. So if we could start with the gentleman over there.
Hello, also a student, Alex from Warwick. So, as a man, I would say that he's been most involved in the sort of New Labour project, and albeit sporadically, but from 85 up until the end in 2010. And obviously now, as has been said, with the benefit of hindsight and the Corbyn leadership and what's happened to the party over the last decade, what would you say in terms of reforming the party or the project is like the one thing that you wished you had sort of done or could have done or regret that might have avoided sort of the last decade of what occurred with the party and the leadership?
Thank you. Let's take another question from this side of the room while the microphone is there. The lady behind the gentleman who's just spoken.
Leslie Smith. Peter, I'm delighted that you remember the 97 campaign as being a campaign of equals in which we all had equal value, because I have to say it's not how it felt at the time. But I want to take you back to the period before that, because I worked for Peter in the 90s, and I recall the absolute vigour and force with which you had a vision that we had to communicate to the country of economic competence and reliability and trustworthiness. And that was relentless, that focus. And you worked with the Shadow Cabinet, and much has been written about, and I have to say I recall the deep frustration I had at the time of your relationship with Gordon and Tony, and the fact that that triumvirate was so pivotal to how we campaigned and how we made decisions. We now have, I guess, 18 months to a general election in which to establish something that you took and the people around you with great experience took pretty much a decade to establish. How do we do that?
Thank you. Let's take those two questions, please.
Well, what can I say? Look, in a sense, Keir has to achieve what both Kinnock and then Blair did over 10 years. And I mean, I went to Walworth Road in 1985, and it was a long, grueling slog for over the next 12 years, which led to our victory in 1997. However, having said that, I think there is quite a lot of institutional memory in the Labour Party that Keir could draw on. I think there's quite a lot of experience and skill available to him in the Labour Party if he chose to turn to it. And I think that it's not necessary for him literally to reinvent the wheel in 18 months, because the Labour Party, has actually come a remarkable distance in the last 2 years, considering where we started in 2019. I mean, look at the results today. There is still a distance to go, by the way, between now and the next general election. But I think this has been a turnaround election for us. These are the best results now we're seeing today than I can recall over the last decade. And it has been a decade of decline for the Labour Party.
In 2017?
And, absolutely, 2017. That was basically a rerun of the Brexit referendum, in which half the country who will remain lined up behind the Labour Party, and the other half of the country who were still leave lined up behind the Conservatives. The Conservative share of the vote therefore went up, and so did ours, because the Liberal Democrat Remainers came to Labour, not because they thought they were electing a Labour government, let alone likely to see Jeremy Corbyn going into number 10 the next day, but because they wanted to, stake their Remain flag in the ground. That's the explanation of 2017. Where on earth was I? How did we get into that now? No, you see, you're very naughty. You're throwing me. It's constant heckling.
Yes. I've been
So-
studying Jeremy Paxman.
So I think that he doesn't literally have to reinvent the wheel, but my God, there has got to be an intensity of effort and thought and real drilling down policy-wise now from Keir and his team. It's got to go whizzing up the agenda and the priority list because the public basically wants to hear our diagnosis of the country's problems. They want to know what our weaknesses are and what our downsides are. They also want to know what our challenges are and our strengths and our opportunities as a country. And they want to be able to recognise and agree, as it were, with what the Labour Party is saying about the state of the country. And then they want to look at those challenges, or look at both parties, as it were, through the lens of those challenges and make a judgment as to who has the better set of policies to address them. Is it a Labour Party, with our own approach, or is it a fifth-term Conservative government that they think will be better at addressing the challenges facing the country? Now, at the moment, the political debate or focus, and indeed what the Labour Party is talking about, is insufficiently in that area. And that's where we've got to move on, as I say, from a sort of party renewal project to a governing project. And I think there is time to do that with sufficient intensity. The first question, though, was about what do I regret that we didn't do party reform-wise? Look, the truth is that we thought we had really changed the thinking, the culture of the Labour Party, that sea change that had taken place in the 1990s and from which the new Labour government emerged and then carried on over the coming 13 years, really would change the Labour Party permanently. And look, frankly, if there had been literally 1% difference outcome in the leadership election in 2010, you would have seen a continuation of New Labour under a very different leader. And not the same New Labour, because you'd have seen the continuation of a revisionist project had David Miliband been elected as our leader. He would have rethought through and readapted New Labour to new policy questions and new policy challenges that were facing the country. That is what revisionism is all about. And had he been able to do that, I have absolutely no doubt at all in my mind that David Cameron would not have been elected in 2015. But the fact is that he finally got a majority, one that we had denied him in 2010. He was saddled with this commitment to a Europe referendum, which he thought that the continuation of the coalition government would usefully prevent him from having to discharge, but he had to do it, and the rest is history. So I'm afraid from that 1%, courtesy of the trade unions, actually in 2010, it wasn't actually the trade unions, it was Unite who gave us that 1% difference in the leadership, in the result of the leadership election in 2010. And from that, we had decline of Labour, re-election of a majority Conservative government under David Cameron, the Brexit referendum, and all the colossal damage that is going to ensue as a result of the loss of that referendum.
We are almost
All
out of
due
time,
to that 1%.
but we can't finish on such a bleak note. So I'm going to take one very quick question from Alan Evans and a brief answer, if we could.
Thank you. Alan Evans. I was a civil servant during the New Labour years, had the privilege of working for a number of ministers, including Peter Mandelson, latterly a PhD student at Queen Mary University. A lot of comments have been made today about the successes of New Labour on the Constitution, Scottish Welsh devolution, Mayor of London, and probably most of all, the Good Friday Agreement. But the one area actually New Labour ducked was reform of the House of Lords with its compromise on hereditary peers. I wonder, Peter.
Yeah, we didn't duck it.
Well, we compromised in terms of keeping hereditary peers.
Sorry, 90.
92. But
92.
Briefly, if we could.
Well,
sorry,
I want to. He interrupted me, not the other end. I want to know what Peter's view is it now. What is Peter's view on that now?
On the House of Lords? What is my view on the House of Lords? I know I should go there more diligently. I've never claimed a penny in any allowance through my membership of the House of Lords. I sometimes enjoy speaking in the House of Lords. Do I think it should be a priority reform for an incoming Labour government? I think you'd find very quickly that it displaced an awful lot else that you wanted to do, which is frankly of greater importance to the country. But I'm not against reform.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think that's all we've got time for. We could talk there are lots more questions that we could discuss, but we are standing between you and the drinks reception, and New Labour would never have done that. So can we close by thanking Peter Mandelson for a fascinating discussion?